Welcome. It's so good to see all of you. Our program this evening is going to be introduced by my good colleague and our wonderful librarian, Patrick Spiro. But I did want to take a minute to put a plug in, an invitation to all of you to be with us again next week, Wednesday, March the 29th, for a program on criminalizing medicine, the practice of medicine. And we're going to start in the afternoon, to which you're all welcome to attend, at 2 o'clock here in Franklin Hall, with talks by experts on the ethics, the law, and the medicine of the current very wide-ranging conversation regarding medicine and the practice of medicine these days. At 5:30, we will reconvene and we will have a reception again, and then we will be joined by former Secretary of Health and Human Services, Lanah Sawyer, and she will give a keynote entitled Criminalization and Punishment in American Medicine. And then she will then be joined on stage by a professor from Penn, a pediatric ethicist from the Children's Hospital here in Philadelphia, and also a gentleman who, gentleman? Yes, I have a gentleman. Who will also answer some questions regarding the legal aspects of this conversation. So I hope that you will all put this on your calendar. Again, it's Wednesday evening, and come and join us for what is really going to be a very interesting and important conversation in this day and age. So with that invitation, I turn it over to my good colleague, Patrick Spiro.
Thank you, Annie. And now it is my pleasure to introduce my friend and great. But before I actually get to those formalities, I also want to talk about some other events that are happening, to put them on your radar screen. The first, I just want to second everything Annie said about the event on March 29th. I think the whole day is going to be a really fascinating and thoughtful and provocative day of discussion, but the keynote in particular is going to be a very rich conversation. I was trying to think of all the words you could use to describe, I think, the conversation that Lanah Sawyer and others are going to have about the criminalization of medicine. It's going to be complex, important, and most of all, it's a very pressing topic. So I hope you all can come. Also, it's a very busy week for us. On March 30th, we have a Friends preview of our next museum exhibition, Pursuit and Persistence, 300 Years of Women in Science. So if you're a friend, we're having a special reception on that Thursday. If you're not a friend, you should become a friend so you can come to the special reception. This is a fascinating exhibition. It highlights the pioneering women scientists whose papers reside in our vault. We've brought out these stories and are sharing them with the world, including that of Nobel laureate Barbara McClintock. So I hope you all will be able to, if not come on the 30th, at least visit our museum gallery. The official opening for the public is March 31st. That's the Friday. We also have a very busy April. I won't list all the events we have, but just encourage you to visit our website, amphilsoc.org. That's AMPHILSOC.org. Great. So the reason we're all here is to hear John talk about the Sewing Girl's Tale, which if you didn't hear, I think we all owe John a big round of applause before we even get to the introduction, because it just received the Bancroft Prize. Which is awarded every year to the best work in American history. So congratulations, John. So as background, I met John when I was a graduate student at the McNeil Center. He was working on his first book then, Bodies Politic, Negotiating Race in the American North. And he's gone on to have a very prolific career. He's now the professor at UNC Chapel Hill. But as I was preparing for this introduction, I realized there's a lot about John that I didn't know. And it's all the various things that he's done aside from being a historian. He has been a newspaper boy, a gardener, a library page, we could use you across the street maybe, a pizza maker, a park ranger, a gas station attendant, which actually we share that. In fact, that's the favorite job I've ever had, until this one, of course. He was the owner of a beekeeping startup, and he was a tour guide at the house that Louisa May Alcott wrote Little Women. And he's also a father of 3 children, including a newborn. So we should give him a round of applause for that, too. I spent some time reading this book, and there's a reason it won the prize, the Bancroft Prize. This is an incredibly important story. It's a captivating story, and I cannot tell you how well and powerfully it was written and done. So I hope you all, after this talk, will purchase this book, talk to John about it, because it really is a phenomenal work, and I'll just leave it at that. And with that, John?
All right. Well, sorry. I'm trying to make sure my mic is on, but you guys are so much ahead of me that I don't even have to worry about that. I just want to say I'm so happy and honored to be here. The American Philosophical Society has played actually an important part in my professional life since I was a graduate student in the 1980s. So this is, 4 decades. I've benefited from the research collections in the library and from research fellowships that helped improve the kind of research I was able to do for my dissertation and my earlier work. And there's actually a crazy document, an early American sex diary that appears in this book in a small role. That I was just across the street looking at. So thank you, Patrick, and thanks to the Philosophical Society. This is the book. I'm not shy, so this is the paperback cover with a Bancroft notice on it. The Sewing Girl's Tale tells a story that for a long time I thought I knew. And it's a story that even today can sound all too familiar. Late one summer's day in 1793, 17-year-old Lanah Sawyer was walking down Broadway in New York City when she attracted the attention of a group of Frenchmen. They began to harass her. And as they shouted out catcalls, she kind of shrank back, and a young gentleman interposed himself. This gentleman rescued Lana. He escorted her home. He asked her out for an evening walk a few days later, and he introduced himself. But instead of giving her his name, which was Henry Bedloe, he told her that his name was Lawyer Smith. As it happens, Henry Bedloe had a reputation as a great rake, meaning serial sexual predator, and he was aware that he had a reputation in the city, and he was trying to pass under her radar. I show this map just to say that New York City in 1793, as you may have gotten from the opening image, was a small town, really, 30,000, 40,000 people, but even just on the very tip of the Manhattan Island. But even in a town of 40,000 people, or a university like UNC of 40,000 people, there's a lot of people you know by reputation, but you don't know by sight. And Henry Bedloe was in that situation. So Lana, believing this was Lawyer Smith, went out for that walk a few evenings later. And it started out innocently enough, an evening walk. They stopped for a glass of ice cream down the road. And as my mother used to say, I've always got time for ice cream. And they ended up on the Battery. Here's an engraving of the Battery, the sketch for which was done about a month before their walk. The Battery had just been turned into a public park in the years before. So this evening starts out with this kind of innocent diversion, this public promenade in this open space. And ended several hours later with him dragging Lanah Sawyer into the back room of a brothel run by a woman named Mother Carey. And this, believe it or not, is a sketch of Mother Carey's brothel, marked with a green cross on the right. That may be her sweeping the stoop. Crazy image done by the son of George Washington's dentist in New York. Lana was traumatized and disoriented by what happened that night, but the next day she gathered herself and went home. And within a week, she had formally charged Henry Bedloe with rape. The trial came within a month, and after a wrenching courtroom drama that lasted about 15 hours, which they did all in one sitting, the jury took 15 minutes to deliberate. And they returned a shocking verdict of not guilty. And that, I pretty much thought, was the end of the story. This was decades ago, around the time that Ms. Magazine first coined the term date rape. And that was pretty much how I and other colleagues at graduate school at the time saw it. It was a particularly vivid and troubling example of the enduring problem of acquaintance rape. When I began teaching, I started using this case because a published record of the trial was available. It was the first published record of a rape trial in American history. And I used it in college classes to try and help students think about the origins of modern rape culture. And then about 10 years ago, a graduate student I was working with found a document that really threw me for a loop. She came across a newspaper notice, a reference to another newspaper article that really called my questions about the case into my assumptions about the case into question. And I wondered, could I really have been so wrong? Was I that naive? Was I that credulous? So I must say my pride was piqued, but so was my curiosity. So I started to investigate, digging into the surviving evidence, scrounging around for clues, and the more I learned, the more astonishing, and I think often puzzling, and ultimately I think more meaningful the story became. At the most basic level, I learned that the rape trial wasn't the end of this story. In some ways, it was just the beginning. And ultimately, this book became an opportunity for me to explore the momentous period after the American Revolution, not through the eyes of the so-called founding fathers, but rather through the eyes of a kind of an ordinary person, a young working-class woman, a 17-year-old seamstress. And if Lanah Sawyer hadn't responded to this sexual assault in a really unusual way, she might have vanished from the historical record without any trace at all. Over time, what emerged was a story of a young woman looking to make her own way in the world, in a city full of possibility and danger, a story of working men fed up with being disparaged and dismissed by snobbish men clinging to inherited privileges. It was a story of early feminists making bold new arguments about human rights at a time when the only way most single women could earn a living was by working as a prostitute. This evening, I suppose I have about half an hour, and I wanted to spend that time sharing with you a little bit about how I went about exploring Lanah Sawyer's story, and some of the struggles I faced trying to make sense of it. And I'll just warn you, I'm going to focus on the first two-thirds of the book, because the last part, I don't want to spoil the spoilers. These are three issues that really I wrestled with working on this project. So one basic question was, who really was Lanah Sawyer, and where did she get the courage to stand up for herself in the way she did? Late in the summer of 1793, it was really easy to underestimate Lanah Sawyer. She was only 17. She came from a family of modest means, such modest means that she was already working as a seamstress to help support the household. The man who called himself Lawyer Smith, in contrast, and who was actually the rich and well-connected Henry Bedloe, clearly made assumptions about her that turned out to be very mistaken. And so did the brothel keeper, Mother Carey, who let Lana into her house that night. Both of them assumed that what happened that night would be the end of it, that Lana would shrink away in shame and silence, that she would want to cover up what had happened to her, that she wouldn't dare to stand up for herself in a way that would cause any significant problem for them. And they had good reason to think that. That's what most survivors of acquaintance rapes did in the 18th century. It's what most survivors of acquaintance rapes and other kinds of harassment and assault do today. Today, most sexual assaults, a large proportion of sexual assaults are among acquaintances, by which we mean that the survivor knows the perpetrator, but only a small fraction, something often estimated as 15%, end up publicly reported. And that's the public report, not the filing of charges or the trial or the conviction. Most survivors, for good reasons, feel that seeking legal recourse is not in their best interest. And in Lanah Sawyer's day, there were even stronger pressures for young women to keep a sexual assault secret. In the literature of the day, and this is kind of a classic visual representative of the problem of seduction for young women. This is the first in a series of plates by William Hogarth called The Harlot's Progress, which begin with the young innocent woman arriving in the city, being seized upon by a madam who's got her face pockmarked with black syphilis sores, and in the back is the gentleman for whom the madam is procuring this young woman. The idea is, and then ultimately this woman gets duped into a situation where she's raped, and then she's told that she's ruined, and then she ends up being reduced to prostitution, and ends up dying of venereal disease. And the basic cultural narrative, cultural script in the early American Republic was that a woman who lost her virginity outside of wedlock was considered to be fallen or ruined. She became a social outcast, a pariah, destined for a life of prostitution, perhaps, alcoholism, madness, perhaps, but in any case, an early death. That's not actually what happened to young women in that situation, but that was the cultural narrative. In this instance, the man Lana would be up against was not only older, but from a far higher social status. He was a gentleman, in a period when gentleman was a badge of status, not a character affirmation. He was from a rich and well-connected family. But an early sign of how badly both Henry Bedloe and Mother Carey underestimated Lanah Sawyer came the morning after, as she emerged from the brothel's back room, having sewn back together her damaged dress. And in the hallway waiting for her was Mother Carey, and it's interesting that we know that this was a dark, narrow hallway. It was no more than 3 feet wide, so it wouldn't meet code today. And Mother Carey is there waiting and says, "Dearie," addressing Lana, "Dearie, I can spirit you out the back door, or we can go see if there's anyone on the street out front." And Lana rejects the premise of the question. Mother Carey was trying to cast Lana as the shame-faced seduction victim who would want to not be seen coming out of a brothel and would not want to be seen on the street by anyone she knew. And instead, Lana rejects the whole setup. She says, "No, I will go out the front door, and I don't care who sees me, even if it's my father." In fact, after that moment of bravado deposited Lanah Sawyer on the front stoop of Mother Carey's house, her courage dissolved. She, in fact, was terrified of her father, or technically her stepfather, whose name was John Callanan. He was a violent man, even by the standards of the time. And she was afraid that instead of listening to her and hearing her story about why she'd been out all night he would beat her up and kick her out. It took almost all day for her to gather the courage to get home and to report what had happened to her mother first and then to her stepfather. But instead of kicking her out of his house, he ended up becoming a remarkably effective and legally savvy ally. And part of what explains this reaction is the fact that Lanah Sawyer's family was actually less humble than they might first appear. Her actual father, her birth father, was a skilled craftsman. He made carriages during the Revolutionary War period and was thus of a middling economic status. Her mother's family had deep roots in the city. For example, before the Revolution, her mother owned, or at least sold, 2 separate lots of real estate in actually the same neighborhood that Lana was living in 20, 30 years later. So these were respectable artisans with skilled trades. Perhaps most surprisingly to me, to you, perhaps to me certainly, was that Lana's great uncle, John Dykeman, who had started out as a baker, had become rich enough during the 1760s that he retired, like Benjamin Franklin, from the workaday business of his firm, began to rent out the bakery, which actually happens to have been across the street from where Lana was living in 1793, and acquired a country seat about in what was then the country, just below Canal Street now. And he bought this dike, what's called the dike, at the time was on the famous John Montresor map of New York City in 1776 as the Dykeman Farm. And these are gentlemen's country seats, also working farms. He also was elected to the position of alderman of the city of New York, which at the time was a major political office and a high honor. So Lana grew up with an uncle, great uncle, who was one of the most powerful political forces in the city, and who lived about a half a mile walk from where her father's workshops were at the base of Bowery Lane. That's Francis Sawyer, her father. And what's interesting is that even though also aldermen are among the men that you would report crimes to. So if you wanted to report a crime, there were no police in the city, are you with me? This is before police. So you would go to an alderman to report an assault. So she may well have heard from her uncle's conversation about people coming to him to report crimes. In any case, her uncle had died about 5 years earlier, but his widow, Rebecca Dykeman, was the first person Lana sought out on the morning after the assault as she was gathering herself in order to go home. As it happened, this aunt, whose name was Rebecca Dykeman, lived with another, even richer and better connected woman, whose name was Judith Bayard Van Rensselaer Bruce, who, among other things, was the aunt of Alexander Hamilton. She was the money side of that arrangement. Her niece was Eliza Schuyler. Her son inherited the manor of Lower Rensselaerwick, making him one of the richest people in the country at the time. So Mrs. Bruce is a very high-status individual in the city. It comes from the Bayard family, which owned a much larger country estate just next to the Dykemans, which is presumably how they became acquainted. So the point here is Lana came from a working-class family, but they had deep roots in the city, and they also had relatives who were affluent and well-connected. At the same time, I think it wasn't just the family background that explains how the story developed. I think it was also clearly a result of her personal qualities, her personal skills. Lana turned out to be really good at recruiting allies. And when she got to court during the rape trial, she was clearly a very forceful and effective witness. I should just mention from this map that the Rutgers farm is a property owned by Henry Bedloe's mother and her 3 siblings. So that's why the Rutgers farm is on the map. His family money comes from the Rutgers estate. There's a chapter in the book called Gatekeepers, because then and now, in order to mount a successful legal prosecution, there were a series of people, in Lana's case, all of them affluent, older, white men, who had the power to stop her claim or to put their weight behind it. So in part, Lana's story is explained by her complex family background, in part by her own kind of moxie and by her own persuasive skills. I had similar questions about the other key characters in this story, one of them being the brothel keeper, Mother Carey. Why did she let Harry Bedloe drag Lanah Sawyer kicking and screaming into her house? That was a risky maneuver for her. Why did she testify the way she did in court? Another character was Lana's stepfather, John Callanan, who I devote some attention to in the book. How did he develop the gumption to stand up against Henry Bedloe? Much less, how did he develop the legal savvy to know how to do so effectively? And how did he develop such a powerful social network that he could mobilize broad support in the aftermath of the trial, the rape trial's not guilty verdict? So what was it that made him such a powerful ally? Another character that appears in the book is Alexander Hamilton. This is not, sadly, Lin-Manuel Miranda's heroic Alexander Hamilton. This is Alexander Hamilton, the working lawyer trying to make money in pretty dastardly ways. But I will just stop by saying that I learned a whole lot about the business of prostitution in the 1790s. I learned a lot about the city's branch pilots, and this is just a great image of branch pilots at work from the period from 1795. John Callanan, Lana's stepfather, was a branch pilot, and I think his profession ultimately explains a lot of his skills and his character. And I learned a lot about the practice of law. So that brings us to kind of another big question. This is the courthouse on Wall Street. That's Trinity Church, Broadway, in the background to orient you to the city. So the second big puzzle I really faced in this book was, how did Henry Bedloe end up getting acquitted in the rape trial, even though his own attorneys admitted that his character was predatory and that his actions had terribly harmed Lanah Sawyer? And the answer to this question has to do with the power dynamics of acquaintance rape prosecutions and with the history of the law. And one of the key figures here is the 17th century English jurist Matthew Hale. And that name may ring a bell for some of you because he played a prominent role last summer in Supreme Court Justice Alito's opinion on the overturning Roe v. Wade. What's important for our purposes is not just Matthew Hale's, often called Lord Hale, is not just his general misogyny, which is egregious, but more specifically his role in creating the modern distinction between stranger rapes and acquaintance rapes as a matter of law. Even today, our culture tends to define violent assaults by strangers as somehow more like real rapes, and date rapes and other kinds of harassment involving acquaintances as something else, something less serious. After Lana had told her story to her stepfather, one of the curious things he did, and this is you wonder like, how did he know to do that? He took her to a private attorney before going to the magistrates. Presumably the idea was partly to evaluate her account, to decide, to get a professional opinion onto whether this was a matter worth making public, because taking it public was a risk. And then also you can imagine that if they decided they were going to go forward, an advantage of having a private attorney is that he in fact prepared a written complaint, so that they got her story in writing, prepared with an attorney's help before they made a formal report, in which case they went to the top legal official, the top alderman, the mayor. And the attorney they went to was a young, just starting out attorney. He had recently passed the bar, from a New Jersey family, and his name was Caleb S. Riggs, and he undoubtedly turned to this book, which is the 4th volume of William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. This is the way that most lawyers in the early Republic would have gotten access to Sir Matthew Hale's legal writings, because Blackstone was a law professor at Oxford who summarized a lot of what Hale had to say about rape law and quoted him extensively in this volume of his commentaries, which became the most widely read legal manual in early America. And what I like about this, the reason I have a picture of it on my dining table, which is a little messy, is that this is Caleb Riggs' copy of this book. So it's like the only thing I know of that Lanah Sawyer may have actually touched, I think undoubtedly was in the same room with. It's an edition, a cheap, small edition published in London in 1786. So I would bet this is the volume that Caleb Riggs consulted as Lana was talking to look through what the law of rape, what the commentators on the law of rape said and how it fit with her story. I actually saw this on the inner tube and bought it. So let me walk you through what's so extraordinary about how Blackstone and before him Hale shifted the law of rape, which had been pretty well settled for something like 500 years before. According to the written statute, and rape is unusual in English legal history in that it's a felony with a written statute, which was passed in 1285. So I'm not kidding about the 500 years old, by 1793. Rape was, quote, the carnal knowledge of a woman against her will. That is to say, rape was a violation of a woman's sexual consent. But in the book of legal commentaries written by Hale and then by Blackstone, rape was redefined in a slightly different way as the carnal knowledge of a woman forcibly and against her will. This is significant because it helped to create a new legal standard that defines rape not so much in terms of consent, which was what the actual statute, which should have been the legally binding authority, but rather in terms of physical violence, force. And typically by force here they mean physical force, not I'll fire you or some other kind of threat. In addition, Hale had argued that because women were so prone to lie, and specifically so prone to lie about sexual assaults, as you've gathered, he saw women as naturally prone to vengefulness and malice. He also was really worried about witchcraft, but that's a separate story. For Hale, because women were so likely to lie in rape cases, it was important for juries in rape cases to consider especially carefully the credibility of a woman's testimony. And to this end, he proposed a series of questions that juries were to consider. He offered kind of a salad bar of questions, and they basically reduced to 4. I'll give you 4 examples. He said first, and the idea is like, these are questions, circumstantial evidence, and if the answers to these questions can be build a woman's credibility or diminish a woman's credibility. So they're kind of side evidence as to whether the rape claim is valid. First is whether the woman in question was of good fame, which is to say, did she have a good reputation? Second was whether she reported the crime while it was recent. Now, what he meant by recent was left unclear, and according to the actual statute, because the actual statute actually wrote down a definition here, there was no legal limit to the time in which the state could prosecute a rape or any other felony. So he's inventing a new standard about how long you have with this vague idea that has to be recent. But there was no statute of limitations in the statute. Third, were there signs of physical violence on her body? Fourth, basically translated to, was she heard crying out for help? Now, what I want to point out is that each of these are standards that are difficult for survivors in most acquaintance rape scenarios to meet, and relatively easier for survivors of stranger rape assaults to meet. Because if your boss is harassing you at work, you are less likely to report the crime immediately. You're less likely to run out of your boss's office saying, "Oh my God, he laid his hands on me." You're less likely to have signs of violence on your body, because the mechanism of compulsion in an acquaintance scenario often has to do with social authority, or I'll fire you. Were you heard crying out for help? You're much less likely to loudly cry out for help in a workplace scenario, or if it's your uncle. Are you with me? But if some guy jumps out from behind a blue light on the Penn campus, you're much more likely to shriek and cry out and report the crime immediately. And you're more likely to end up with signs of violence on you, because stranger rapes tend to happen between men of lower status and women of similar or higher status, and acquaintance rape tend to happen with men of higher status using social pressure. But the fact of the matter is that in this case, Lanah Sawyer appeared to pass all of these criteria with flying colors. She had a good reputation, and witnesses were brought forward to prove that. She testified that she did cry out for help during the crime. There were signs of violence on her body, which her mother and aunt had seen on her physical body, and the one piece of forensic evidence introduced during the trial was her gown. This is not her gown, but I did spend a lot of time researching gowns, so this is what I think, and Linda Baumgarten and others think the gown would have looked like. I wanted to show it to you and to readers of the book, and I wanted to know for myself, because there's a description in the book when the Attorney General introduces the gown, and Lana testifies to how, when Bedloe attacked her in that back room, he tore off her gown, which tells you something about his sexual aim, because there was no underwear really in this period, so he could have just pulled up her skirts, but he wanted her naked, so it tells you something about the meaning of that assault for him. But she testifies that the pins came out of the gown and several of the strings were torn. And so this was a big puzzle for me when I met with Linda Baumgarten, who's the great early American clothing expert. She's like, where are there several strings? So just quickly, because I want to move along and I'm taking too long here, but this is a round gown. It's a transitional period. This is not your Jane Austen-y, flowing, high-waisted Empire-style gown, but this is also not your Revolutionary era mantua. This is kind of a transitional garment, but a very common garment in this period, which has a bodice that closes. The whole gown is one piece sewn together, and the bodice pins together in the front with straight pins. If you were rich, you could have hooks and eyes or some other fancier covering, but an ordinary person would use just pins. And the pins wouldn't stick into your body, don't worry, because you have a heavy corset on underneath. And then the waist, you get the gown on by pulling it up over your, down over your shoulders or up over your waist. But in order to do that with this very tight, cinched waistline, you have to have a drop panel that is held, so the skirt is held up with drawstrings that are tied in front and then covered by the tips, the pointed tips of the bodice. And the testimony here was that so these are likely the strings that were torn and the pins that were popped. And the point of this is that the torn gown is actually really good evidence of a violent assault, because what was expensive about a gown in this period for a woman like Lanah Sawyer, who probably maybe had 3 gowns, even rich women in this period often had only 3 gowns, and this was probably her best. What was expensive was the fabric. The labor was relatively cheap. The labor she got paid for was relatively cheap. So it seemed very unlikely that she would have torn her gown off in the heat of passion like she was in a Lisa Kleypas romance novel. I say that with all respect to my high school classmate, Lisa Kleypas. So this is pretty strong evidence that somebody else took off her gown against her will. In any case, so the point is Lanah Sawyer seems to actually meet these criteria. So what was the problem? Well, the problem was ultimately the behavior of the team of attorneys that Henry Bedloe's family hired to defend him. This is one of them. There were 5 others. I like this portrait in particular because it took a lot of work to track it down in a private collection, but also because it was painted in debtors' prison while the artist was incarcerated. And in the end of the book, which I'm not going to talk about, I will just say the debtors' prison plays a significant role. Because obviously the problem with debtors' prison is how do you get out if you can't do something like paint portraits. Eliza Hamilton, for example, was painted at the same time by the same artist as part of an effort of New Yorkers to get him out of jail so they could get their portraits painted in more comfortable surroundings. So the 6 lawyers, Bedloe's family hired the best possible lawyers in the nation, and together this dream team of attorneys did everything they could to recalibrate the standards of proof and persuasion in rape cases, to rewrite the law of rape, to move the goalposts. So instead of acknowledging that Lana had reported the crime within a reasonable time, Bedloe's attorneys argued that she should have reported it immediately. They argued that what mattered wasn't really whether Bedloe had used some force in the assault. What mattered really was the kind of force that he had used. Because they argued, Richard Harrison, the big society lawyer in this case, one of them, said that any gentleman, knowing the natural delicacy of a woman, won't make her beg for it. So it's only polite for a gentleman to apply a certain amount of force. And that must have been the kind of force that Bedloe had applied. Are you with me? And they relentlessly went after Lanah Sawyer's character. Although she had produced sterling character witnesses, and in fact a series of prosecutions had shown that her reputation was flawless, which was Hale's standard, reputation. They argued that what really mattered wasn't her reputation, it was her internal character. And you can understand how reputation is easier to establish in a court of law than inner character. So they argued that it was possible for a young woman to appear virtuous on the outside, but to be full of what they called dark desires on the inside. And the implication of these claims they made repeatedly, all 5 lawyers were able to give closing arguments. So they were able to repeat, I think they probably spent about 6 hours repeating these claims. So they ended up making Lanah Sawyer, implying that Lanah Sawyer was misleading everybody by pretending to be virtuous while really she wasn't, even though there was no evidence that she wasn't. Point is that instead of simply holding up Lord Hale's standards and letting the jury adjudicate the matter based on Lord Hale's commentaries, which are commonly used by American historians as outrageously misogynistic, they created an entirely new set of standards that were far more egregious and had a very lasting impact on American law. A really gruesome aspect of the trial was the way the defense attorneys tried to use Lanah Sawyer's good reputation against her. Even though the character of the accused perpetrator was bad, they tried to use that in his favor. So there's this upside-down logic. So they would say, for example, given how bad his reputation was, why would you have agreed to go out for a walk with him? Maybe because he was lying about his identity? But at some level, class distinctions was enough for them. As one of her attorneys who lived 2 doors down from her said, what else could a mere sewing girl, and that's why sewing girl's in the title, because it's used to disparage her. She would have called herself a seamstress. What could a mere sewing girl imagine that a gentleman like Henry Bedloe wanted with her? Their argument was that she had essentially pre-consented to having sex the minute she had stepped foot off of her stepfather's stoop. And I just want to explain, I think, what I think is the take-home here, is that we hear a lot these days about how the issue of consent makes acquaintance rape trials difficult. Supposedly in rape trials, the victim's consent is hard to discern. Though you may notice that consent is also at the core of all sorts of other crimes like assault or theft. I didn't steal that car. He loaned it to me. The keys were just sitting there. It was asking to be driven away. It's too easy to hotwire those. They just want people to steal them. It's not an assault. He wanted me to punch him in the nose. So I think the issue here is not, in a lot of acquaintance rape trials, I think the issue is not about credibility. Do you believe the woman consented? Because I think often we don't believe that she consented. The question is whether the jury or the public cares. And I think that has to do with empathy. It has to do with defining who matters socially. And I think that's what the defense team was trying to do, was they were trying to redefine Lanah Sawyer as someone who didn't matter, and to define Henry Bedloe as somebody who did matter. The philosopher Kate Mann at Cornell has described this dynamic in modern rape trials as himpathy, in which you're desensitizing the jurors to harms done to the victim and focusing your attention on what a gentleman like Henry Bedloe has to lose, rather than on what she has already lost. So if you convict a Stanford swimmer of raping Janelle Miller, he won't be able to compete in varsity competitions. His career will be damaged. And she's just a townie. And we see this in that case about which Janelle Miller has written eloquently. We see this in all kinds of other cases I won't get into. I think part of this sympathy advantage men get is basic sexism, and part of it is a dynamic of a trial in which the harm to the survivor has already happened, and the harm that could happen to the perpetrator is in the future. So it's his future that is at stake in the trial, what he has to lose. In any case, we certainly see this in the Bedloe trial. There's no more classic characterization or summation of the issue of himpathy than the refrain the defense lawyers kept saying in the trial. The life of a citizen, they said with horror, is in the hands of a woman. All right. So it may not be that you all need much explanation for the question of my third question, which is, why did this case evoke such outrage, not just among women, but also among men? And we're moving a little faster now. I'll just say that over the years, I've turned up all kinds of evidence about people who were outraged by this case, by the way Lanah Sawyer was treated during the trial, by the verdict the jury reached. There were complaints in the newspapers about the roles of lawyers and money in perverting the course of justice. Women, too, were outraged by the case, and some of them joined the newspaper debate with forceful analyses of sexual double standards. Richard Harrison, who I mentioned earlier, got a series of unhappy letters from his wife about the case. But most puzzling to me was the way the city's working men rose up in outrage. A week after the trial, the city was rocked by a series of riots involving as many as 600 men. And they attacked first Mother Carey's house and reduced it to rubble and a cloud of feathers. They actually forced Mother Carey out of New York City, and she moved to the fair city of Philadelphia, where she set up shop. a few blocks south of here. And in her will, we see both how much she had, like 1,000 pounds at her disposal, which was she was a good businesswoman. And she asked her executors to erect a marble slab with her name and dates on it in Christchurch Cemetery. And it's there still. And it's been acid rained away, so you can't read the inscription. So if you didn't know, you'd think it was Richard Stockton or Benjamin Franklin. So Mother Carey has kind of acquired a kind of respectability in Philadelphia an anonymous respectability in Philadelphia that she did not have at home. But to return to our story. After the rioters destroyed Mother Carey's house, they went on to demolish a series of other brothels. Bedloe's family hired armed guards to protect their house. He fled the city, fearing for his life. And so there's a question of how did these men, mostly working class men like Lanah Sawyer's stepfather, how did they come to see the attack on her as an attack on themselves? And the short answer, I think, is that in the 1790s, New York City was at the forefront of a titanic struggle over the destiny of American politics and over the future of American democracy. The first of a number of struggles over the nature of American democracy. The attorneys repeatedly attempted to dismiss Lanah Sawyer and the witnesses who came forward on her behalf as obscure people whom nobody knew, who really should probably be required to produce character witnesses of their own. Again, this by an attorney who lived 2 doors away from Lana. So when Lanah Sawyer faced off against Henry Bedloe in court, many people saw this conflict not just between a man and a woman, but between champions of democracy and defenders of aristocracy. At the time, many of the founding fathers considered democracy a dangerous idea. They argued that elite men should run the country and that everybody else should know their place. But by 1793, the French Revolution had presented a much more radical vision of equality. And this slide is back because the ship in the harbor of New York City here is the French frigate, the Embuscade. And one of the things that was going on this year in New York City was French and Britain were at war, and French and British warships were both in New York Harbor, and French and British sailors were fighting with each other in the streets. So while some in New York City saw the radicalism of the French Revolution as an inspiration, others saw it as a nightmare. And in any case, part of what citizenship meant to men, so there's a class issue. And then there's a kind of patriarchy issue. Because for all men, citizenship meant, whether they were poor or rich, being a man. And we see this in their targets during the brothels. The rioters expressed their outrage at Henry Bedloe and his attorneys by attacking women who they accused of sexual impropriety. That is, they displaced their anger against elite men onto women they disparaged as sexually unkempt. And this points, I think, to an enduring problem in life, which is the often blurry distinction between alliance and appropriation. Often being an ally, taking on somebody else's ordeal, can turn into a kind of appropriation, taking ownership of their experience and using it for purposes that may be more yours than theirs. All right, in conclusion, there's a ton I don't have time to talk about. There's a whole end of the story, which I promise just gets crazier and more fascinating. I will tell you that Lanah Sawyer did end up getting a dramatic kind of vindication in court. Bedloe did end up being imprisoned for several years as a result of this assault. Lanah Sawyer did end up recouping her life. She got married, and she moved away, quite possibly, to Philadelphia. Although Lanah Sawyer ended up prevailing in important ways, I think it's easy to see her story as not just disturbingly, outrageously familiar, like something that could pretty much happen pretty much the same way today, And it can be depressing to think that society is still stuck in some of the same destructive patterns. Another story of how privileged men get away with illegal, damaging behavior, even in the face of compelling evidence, and even in the face of surprisingly forceful pushback. And there's obviously a lot of truth in that. But over the years that I've worked on this project, I've also come to see this story as offering something else. I think the story tells us something about courage and about the cost of courage. At the end of the book, I use this image of this darning sampler, which I love, as a kind of a metaphor. So this is a sampler that in real life is about the size of a handkerchief. I think it actually was a handkerchief that was used in a sewing school, and what the instructor did was tear a series of holes in the fabric, and then the young women were to repair the holes in the style of various different kinds of fabrics of more or less complexity. And the challenge is both to reproduce the pattern using needle and thread, which is easier on some of these patterns than others. There's one that you can't even see is a jersey knit. So you're literally trying to reproduce a knit stitch with a needle. But also, while you're doing those repairs, you want the ultimate result to lie flat and smooth. And one thing I like about this metaphor of the darning sampler is it's about repair, it's about damage, it's about repair. It's about a kind of damage where the damage never goes away. The hole in the fabric is still there, the torn fibers are still there. They may be disguised by the repair if it's done skillfully enough. So it's about a damage that doesn't heal over, doesn't go away. But it's about making the garment useful again, strong again, resilient, and functional going forward. And I think that's how psychologically a lot of people try to respond to traumatic incidents, is by a kind of healing that doesn't remove the damage, but that allows you to move forward in your life. So the repair, in the case of a darning sample, is kind of an exercise of skill. It's a kind of labor of love. And to me, it's a thing of both frailty and simultaneously of beauty. So what has stuck with me throughout this project is this image of Lanah Sawyer's courage. Standing up against all odds, refusing to be limited by other people's expectations, taking what had happened to herself seriously, refusing to be silenced, taking risks. And sometimes, the whole point of a risk is like, things don't always work out the way you hope they will. So even though Lanah Sawyer's struggle took on a terrible toll on her, she did end up holding her assailant accountable. She did shake up other people's expectations about how the survivor of an acquaintance rape would or should respond. And while she did suffer great anguish and deep despair, she regrouped and went on to continue shaping her own destiny. And so I think at the end of Women's History Month, perhaps the biggest lesson to take from Lanah Sawyer's story is simply this, that if one young woman, a mere sewing girl, could stand up for herself and change the course of American history 200 years ago, we can do the same today. Thank you. So, I talked longer than I promised, but sorry. I'm eager to hear what questions you all have. Yeah?
Did she allege that she was a virgin at the time of the assault? Did she allege that she was a virgin at the time of the assault?
I don't think that was explicitly stated by the prosecution in the rape case, although I think it was implied. There was a subsequent legal action called the seduction suit that was premised on the notion that she was a virgin. But the character witnesses she produced were essentially vouching for her virginity. And so I don't think she claimed that, but like her mother testified that she saw blood on her body that proved that she could no longer be a virgin. So you're right, that was part of the prosecution case. I'm a little slow today. Yeah?
So in these kinds of cases today, the strategy for the plaintiff is very often to bring forward other women and develop sort of a theme that the accused, does this sort of thing over and over again. I'm just curious as to whether or not that was a strategy for Lana as well, and whether or not they tried to prove that Henry was indeed a serial sexual predator.
So I have a lot of thoughts there. One, they didn't have to prove that he was a serial sexual predator in the terms of not necessarily rape, but in terms of exploitation, because his defense attorneys admitted as much. They admitted that he had a reputation as a rake. A rake in this period is a man who ruins women, targets virgins, tricks them into having sex, and then leaves them ruined. It's a kind of, it's like being seduced by the devil. Rake now is like a romance novel thing where like the rake is the charming bad guy who turns out to be a good guy. But no, the rake in this period is what you get if you rake through the coals of hell. It's an evil character. So I don't think they had to really prove that he was a sexual predator in the sense of taking advantage of young women and leaving them damaged. There is a lot of evidence now that sexual assaults are often perpetrated by serial perpetrators. There's one study that argued that the average college rapist rapes 6 women before he graduates and then keeps on raping people afterwards, for example. And there's plenty of evidence from the Catholic Church sex scandals that you have a priest who doesn't just molest one kid, molests kids here until he's caught, move to another parish, molest kids there. So there's good reason why in some high-profile cases prosecutors are able to assemble a series of victims because of the serial nature of acquaintance rape, very often. The experts are now arguing over, is it 85% of rapes are committed by serial sexual acquaintance rapists or only 55%? It's still a large number. I think in most sexual assault cases, you don't get the kind of attention from prosecutors and the resources that are needed to do investigative journalism and whatever to bring down a Harvey Weinstein. That obviously is a whole different level of prosecution, or a Donald Trump. Those are totally different. I mean, I'm just saying there's a very different level of resources are put behind those cases than are put behind an ordinary case in which some boss forces some victim.
If the defense admitted this, didn't that resonate with the jury at all? They didn't care?
I think, well, what the defense said literally was, of course Lana's been damaged, and of course Henry's a terrible person. But this was a case of seduction, not of rape. And rape comes down to the question of how much violence was used. And look at him. And the defense literally said, you should sue him for seduction. You're in the wrong court. This should be civil court. There should be money damages. And then when the criminal trial didn't work, Lana's family did go to civil court. And it was kind of a spectacular use of the law of seduction, which was itself a crazy, fascinating thing. So I don't know if that's satisfying your question, but
You said at the beginning that you knew about this case, but not the second half of the story.
Uh-huh.
And why? Why did you know about it? Was it in some way?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was trying not to take 45 minutes to do that. So I was introduced to this case when I was in graduate school at Princeton in a graduate seminar taught by Christine Stansel, the great women's historian, who wrote about this in her famous book, City of Woman. And then two of her students that I was students with at the time wrote about it in different ways. One, Mary Beth Hamilton, in a beautiful essay on specifically this body of legal records, and then Sharon Block, which some of the historians in the audience will know, for her comprehensive book on all sexual assaults that are recorded in the United States up to 1820, so like 800 cases. So that's when I learned about this case. Estelle Friedman discussed it in her recent book on the history of rape law. So it's been used as an example of acquaintance rape in a lot of histories. What I didn't realize until more recently, not so long, I'm really slow, is that there was this whole other set of dimensions and that there was all this other evidence that could be marshaled to understand this case. And I must say I was really touched this fall because Christine Stansel, I hadn't approached her to blurb the book or anything because she's in very poor health, but she emailed me to say that she loved the book and was having trouble getting to bed because she was staying up at night reading it. And I was like, good, I was afraid you would be like, oh, you've always been a disappointment to me, John, and never more so than now. Yeah.
Did she have any kind of civil recourse?
Yes. Well, and no. So the question is, did Lana have any kind of civil recourse? And the basic answer is, for Lana, there was essentially no meaningful civil recourse. In this period, if you tried to sue somebody for money damages for a physical assault, like Patrick attacked me with a machete and cut off my arm, they would say, oh, poor John, here's $10. But if I went to court and said, Patrick said I had sex with a cow, which is a reputational harm, they'd be like, oh my God, you get Patrick's house. So there's this crazy skew in early American law of damages where physical harms are valued almost at nothing, even if it represents your livelihood, and reputational harms are very highly valued. And in this case, Lana could theoretically have sued for physical damages, and she would have gotten like 25 cents. Instead, they used the law of seduction, which I don't want to tell you about because it's so interesting and you need to buy the book. But they used this insane argument about seduction law in which her stepfather was the one who had standing to sue on the grounds that it was the damage to him. And they won the biggest. Seduction became a huge form of law in American history. Most jurisdictions abolished seduction as a form of civil action in the 70s because the statutes were all written about the seduction of a woman, and it gave a man the right to sue. So I did a little study of this, and all of the Union states abolished their seduction laws, and the Confederate states kept their seduction laws but made them gender neutral. So you may recall, you probably don't because it's not local to you, but when John Edwards was running for president, and there was a sex tape scandal thing with his mistress Riel and his wife Elizabeth, who was dying of cancer. She threatened to sue Riel for seducing her husband away from her. So that was Elizabeth Edwards using law of seduction to get what she needed from her husband's mistress. Anyway, it's a fascinating form of law. This was the first and biggest case of its kind, and it set a kind of a huge precedent. Yeah? Alito did not use the Lanah Sawyer case. He used Hale's commentaries in the abortion decision, which had to do with what did Hale say about abortion. Don't get me started on. The Supreme Court in the abortion case, the originalist, so-called originalist Supreme Court case on abortion had a problem, which is that their legal theory has been that you should interpret the Constitution based on what the founders meant at the time that they wrote the Constitution, which is its own intellectual exercise. But what the evidence was, I really shouldn't be going this far. The evidence was that the founding fathers all thought abortion was fine during the first trimester. That was a settled standard law. So they had to look at 17th century law by crazy misogynists like Hale and at 19th century law, which is not the origin, right? Those are centuries away from the founding fathers. So it was an interesting intellectual maneuver there. But Hale is a good go-to if you need misogynistic readings of Anglo-American law. Yeah. Petra.
Petra, correct. Good evening. To your avail, I must commend this fantastic lecture. And you're such a good advertising of your book. But don't feel bad because I bought it before I read the lecture. So thank you. It's been outstandingly not only educational, but as well as, I would say, I hate to use a word, but it was very entertaining. I could sit here forever. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you. You done?
Won't you all join me in another round of applause and thank our wonderful speaker for this evening?
Thank you.